She shouldn't be sitting up here. The sentence cut through the cabin louder than the hum of the engines cruising 37,000 feet above the Rocky Mountains. Heads turned. Conversations stopped. Even the flight attendants near the galley seemed to freeze for a second before pretending nothing had happened. 17-year-old Ava Brooks looked up from the novel resting in her lap and saw the woman staring directly at her. The passenger sat across the aisle in a tailored cream blazer, her expression twisted with certainty, as though she had already decided the entire story before hearing a single word. Ava swallowed and glanced at her boarding pass again. Seat 2A. First class. Exactly where she belonged. Yet somehow, that didn't seem to matter. Flight attendant Nicole Hart appeared almost immediately, her polished smile already fading before she reached Ava's row. "Miss, can I see your boarding pass again?" she asked. Ava handed it over politely. Nicole studied it longer than necessary. Then she looked at Ava, then back at the ticket. Around them, curiosity spread through the cabin like smoke. The woman across the aisle folded her arms. "That's the girl I mentioned," she said. "She was wandering around before boarding. I knew something felt off." Ava blinked. She had never spoken to the woman before. Nicole's jaw tightened. "Can you tell me your name?" "Ava Brooks." "And where are you traveling today?" The questions came quickly now, not conversational. Investigative. Ava felt the eyes of strangers settling on her shoulders. The cabin suddenly seemed smaller. "Colder." "Seattle," she answered quietly. Nicole nodded but didn't look convinced. She signaled toward another crew member standing near the front galley. Within moments, 2 flight attendants were whispering while occasionally glancing toward Ava's seat. The atmosphere shifted. What had begun as suspicion was becoming something heavier. Something public. Ava sat perfectly still. Her hoodie was plain gray. Her sneakers were clean but simple. She looked like a teenager flying alone because that was exactly what she was. Yet every glance directed toward her seemed to carry the same silent question. "Are you really supposed to be here?" A businessman in row 1 lowered his tablet. Another passenger leaned into the aisle for a better look. Nobody knew Ava maintained a 4.0 GPA. Nobody knew she volunteered every weekend tutoring middle school students. Nobody knew she had flown dozens of times before without causing a single problem. In that moment, all they saw was a black teenager sitting in one of the most expensive seats on the plane. Nicole returned with a tighter expression than before. "Miss Brooks, we need to verify a few things." The words landed like a warning. Ava felt her stomach sink. Outside the window, endless clouds stretched across the afternoon sky. Inside the cabin, the distance between truth and assumption was about to become very dangerous. Ava Brooks had learned a long time ago that staying calm did not always stop people from making assumptions. She sat with her hands folded neatly over the closed novel in her lap, while Nicole Hart disappeared behind the curtain, separating the first-class cabin from the galley. The whispers continued anyway. They drifted through the air like turbulence nobody could see, but everyone could feel. Ava stared out the window for a moment. Below, the mountains looked small and distant beneath a blanket of white clouds. Up here, everything should have felt peaceful. Instead, every passing second seemed to pull more attention toward seat 2A. What nobody in the cabin knew was that Ava was not nervous about flying. She had been traveling alone for years. Her father believed independence was something you practiced, not something you talked about. At 14, she had flown to academic competitions. At 15, she attended leadership programs across the country. At 16, she represented her school at a national debate event in Washington, D.C. Airports never intimidated her. Neither did crowded rooms. But moments like this were different. Moments when strangers decided who she was before she ever spoke. A man across the aisle adjusted his glasses and continued watching her. A woman near the front pretended to read a magazine while listening closely to every word spoken by the crew. Ava could feel it. The quiet. Judgment. The curiosity. The suspicion. Nicole returned carrying a tablet. Another crew member followed beside her. His name tag read Brian Keller. Unlike Nicole, he did not even attempt to smile. He glanced at Ava's seat assignment and then at Ava herself. His expression changed almost immediately. It was subtle, barely noticeable, but Ava had seen that look before. The look that asked a question without saying it aloud. Brian leaned toward Nicole and whispered something. Nicole nodded. Then both of them looked directly at Ava again. The cabin suddenly felt colder. Ava reached into her backpack and pulled out a small folder containing her boarding documents. Everything was organized. Everything was valid. She had always been careful. Her father taught her that preparation mattered because sometimes people looked harder for mistakes when they expected to find them. At the front of the aircraft, Nicole tapped rapidly across the screen of her tablet. Brian folded his arms. Several seconds passed, then a full minute. The delay itself seemed to create suspicion where none existed before. Passengers noticed. Heads turned again. The atmosphere shifted further. Ava remained perfectly composed. She refused to give anyone a reason to describe her as upset or difficult. Yet inside, disappointment quietly settled into her chest. She had been excited for this trip. Her father had promised they would spend the weekend together after months of conflicting schedules. Seattle was supposed to be a break from school deadlines and college applications. Instead, she found herself becoming the center of a story she never volunteered to join. Then Nicole looked up from the tablet and exchanged a glance with Brian. Neither of them looked relieved. Neither of them looked satisfied. They looked like people who had already reached a conclusion and were now searching for evidence to support it. And that was the moment Ava realized this was no longer about verifying a boarding pass. It was becoming something much bigger. The change happened gradually at first. A whisper became a conversation. A conversation became a narrative. And before Ava Brooks realized it, people around her were no longer asking what happened. They were deciding what must have happened. Brian Keller stood near the front of the cabin speaking quietly into a handset, while Nicole Hart remained beside her seat with the stiff posture of someone convinced she was protecting the aircraft from a problem. The problem, apparently, was a 17-year-old girl who had done nothing more than sit in the seat printed on her boarding pass. Ava watched as Brian glanced toward her again. Then he spoke into the handset once more. A few passengers noticed. More heads turned. The businessman across the aisle closed his tablet completely. The woman in the cream blazer looked almost satisfied, as though her suspicion had become contagious. Nicole lowered her voice. "Miss Brooks, there appear to be inconsistencies that we need to resolve." Ava looked up calmly. "What inconsistencies?" Nicole hesitated. "We are still reviewing information." It was not an answer. It was a shield. The kind people used when they wanted authority without accountability. Ava kept her voice steady. "My boarding pass was scanned at the gate. I checked in normally. I have my identification." Nicole nodded but offered nothing in return. Around them, silence deepened. Then Brian returned carrying a tablet of his own. He leaned toward Nicole and spoke quietly, but not quietly enough. Ava caught fragments. Seat verification. Passenger concern. Security review. The words floated through the cabin like storm clouds gathering over open water. Passenger concern. The phrase echoed in Ava's mind. Concern from whom? The woman who had never spoken to her before today? The strangers who had spent the last 20 minutes staring at her? Somehow their discomfort was beginning to carry more weight than her documentation. A man 2 rows behind spoke loudly enough for several people to hear. "If there is an issue, they should probably move her." Another passenger nodded. Nobody asked for evidence. Nobody asked for facts. The assumption itself was becoming proof. Nicole straightened. "Miss Brooks, we may need you to relocate temporarily while we complete verification." Ava felt every eye in the cabin shift toward her at once. The pressure was immediate, heavy, public. She looked directly at Nicole. "Why would I leave my assigned seat?" Nicole's expression hardened slightly. "We are trying to avoid disruption." The irony almost made Ava laugh. She had not raised her voice. She had not argued. She had not complained. Yet somehow she was being described as the disruption. Brian folded his arms. Cooperation would help resolve this faster. Ava looked from one crew member to the other. The answer had already been decided. The investigation was simply trying to catch up with the conclusion. Near row 3, a woman with dark brown hair quietly lowered the magazine she had been pretending to read. Her name was Emily Foster. Unlike most passengers, she had been watching everything from the beginning. Every question, every glance, every inconsistency. And for the first time since the situation began, someone in the cabin seemed less interested in the story being told and more interested in whether it was actually true. Emily Foster had boarded the flight in Denver and taken seat 3C with every intention of sleeping through the trip to Seattle. Instead, she found herself watching something that refused to make sense. She had seen Ava Brooks during boarding. She remembered it clearly because the teenager had been one of the first passengers welcomed into the first-class cabin. The gate agent had smiled. The boarding pass had scanned without issue. Nothing about the process looked unusual. Nothing looked suspicious. Yet somehow, 40 minutes later, the same passenger was being treated as though her presence required investigation. Emily lowered her magazine completely and listened as Nicole Hart continued speaking in careful corporate language. The words sounded professional. The tone sounded official. But the facts never seemed to arrive. Every explanation led to another explanation. Every question created another question. The truth remained strangely absent. Ava sat quietly in seat 2A while strangers debated her legitimacy as though she were not sitting 3 feet away. Emily watched the teenager's expression. No anger. No attitude. No disruption. Just disappointment. The kind that comes from realizing people have already decided who you are. Near the window, the woman in the cream blazer shook her head dramatically. I knew something felt wrong, she said. You can usually tell. Several passengers nodded along. Emily felt her stomach tighten. You can usually tell. The phrase lingered in the air. Tell what exactly? Nobody answered. Nobody asked. Because deep down, everyone understood what had actually been said. Brian Keller glanced toward the front galley again. We are following procedure, he announced. The statement sounded strong until Emily remembered the procedure she had witnessed with her own eyes at the gate. Ava had boarded normally. Ava had been welcomed normally. Ava had done everything normally. The story being told now did not match the story Emily had already seen. She finally raised her hand. Excuse me. The cabin became quiet. Nicole turned toward her. Yes, ma'am. Emily sat forward. I was at the gate during boarding. Her ticket scanned successfully. Nicole's smile tightened. We appreciate your concern. Emily was not finished. I also watched her enter this cabin before most passengers arrived. Brian stepped in quickly. There are details you may not be aware of. Emily looked directly at him. Then maybe share them. The silence that followed felt heavier than the engines beneath the floor. Several passengers exchanged glances. For the first time, the narrative began to wobble. A young man across the aisle quietly lowered his headphones. Another passenger stopped pretending to read. The room was changing. Slowly, subtly. People were beginning to notice that certainty had arrived long before evidence. Emily reached for her phone and opened the notes application. She started recording times, names, statements. Not because she wanted attention, because something felt wrong, deeply wrong. Ava noticed and gave her a small, grateful nod. Emily returned it. Across the cabin, Nicole and Brian exchanged another uneasy look. They had expected compliance. They had expected agreement. What they had not expected was a witness. And witnesses had a dangerous habit of remembering details. Ava Brooks looked down at her phone resting beside the closed novel. For almost an hour she had answered questions, repeated facts, and remained calm while strangers debated whether she belonged in the very seat she had legally purchased. The aircraft continued west through clear skies, but inside the cabin the atmosphere felt heavier with every passing minute. Emily Foster had stopped pretending to read altogether. Several passengers were openly watching now. Even those who agreed with the crew earlier seemed less certain than before. Nicole Hart and Brian Keller remained near the front galley, speaking in low voices and checking information that never appeared to settle anything. Ava stared through the window. The clouds below looked endless. White, quiet, unbothered. She wished the cabin felt the same. Instead, disappointment settled deeper inside her chest. Not because of the questions, not because of the attention, but because she recognized the pattern. At 12 years old, she had walked into a private academic competition in Chicago wearing a school sweatshirt and carrying a backpack. A volunteer had assumed she was there to deliver supplies. At 14, she attended a leadership conference where someone asked if she was in the right ballroom before asking anyone else. At 16, a security employee followed her through an airport bookstore while ignoring every other teenager nearby. Different cities, different faces, same feeling. The feeling of needing to prove she belonged before anyone bothered to learn who she was. Ava blinked slowly and returned to the present. The cabin lights seemed slightly dimmer as the afternoon stretched on. A flight attendant she had not met approached quietly. Unlike the others, her expression carried no judgment, only uncertainty. Miss Brooks, she said softly, you are allowed to make one phone call if you need to contact a family member regarding the situation. Ava nodded once. Her fingers tightened around the phone. There was only one person she wanted to call. She opened her contacts and pressed a familiar name. Dad. The line rang once, twice, then connected immediately. Ava. The voice on the other end was warm, steady, and instantly familiar. For the first time all day, she felt her shoulders relax. Hi, Dad. A pause followed. Marcus Brooks knew his daughter well enough to hear what she was not saying. What happened? He asked quietly. Ava looked around the cabin. Every eye seemed farther away now. They say there is a problem with my seat. Another pause. Longer this time. Colder. Ava, Marcus said carefully. Tell me exactly what is happening. She swallowed. The words felt heavier than she expected. Dad, they do not believe I belong here. Silence filled the line. Not confusion. Not surprise. Silence. The kind that appears when someone suddenly understands far more than they wish they did. Then Marcus spoke again. His voice remained calm, but something underneath it had changed. I am going to handle this, he said. Just stay where you are. And before Ava could respond, the call ended. The cabin remained unaware. But somewhere beyond the clouds, a chain of events had just begun. More than 800 miles away, Marcus Brooks lowered his phone and stared through the floor-to-ceiling windows of a conference room overlooking downtown Seattle. The city stretched beneath a gray afternoon sky. Traffic moved. Ferries crossed Elliott Bay. Business continued as usual. But inside the room, everything had just changed. Marcus rarely interrupted meetings. His executives knew that. They also knew the expression on his face now. Calm. Focused. Dangerous. Not because he was angry. Because he had reached a conclusion. Around the conference table, conversations slowly faded. Laptops closed. Coffee cups paused halfway to lips. Nobody had heard the call, but everyone could feel its weight. Marcus looked toward his executive assistant, Rachel Bennett. I need information on Flight 728 immediately. Rachel did not ask questions. She simply nodded and began typing. Within seconds, multiple screens illuminated across the room. Passenger manifests. Flight records. Internal communication logs. Marcus remained standing. Silent. The room seemed to orbit around that silence. Rachel glanced up. Ava boarded normally. Marcus nodded once. He already knew she would have. Her seat assignment? Confirmed. First class. Seat 2A. Another executive. Exchanged a glance with someone beside him. The pieces were already beginning to form. Rachel continued. There are notes attached to the flight activity. Marcus looked up. Read them. Rachel hesitated. Passenger concern. Seat verification review. Ongoing crew investigation. The room became noticeably quieter. One executive frowned. Another removed his glasses and rubbed his forehead. Marcus said nothing. He did not need to. Everyone present understood the implication. Rachel opened another report. There is no issue with the ticket. No issue with identification. No issue with payment records. A long pause followed. Then why is there an investigation? Marcus asked. Nobody answered because nobody could. Across the country, 37,000 feet above the ground, Ava remained seated while adults searched for a problem that apparently did not exist. Back on the aircraft, Emily Foster noticed another shift in the atmosphere. Nicole Hart checked her tablet again. Brian Keller reviewed information a second time. Their confidence seemed less certain now. Less polished. More strained. Facts had a way of doing that. They complicated assumptions. Ava remained quiet. She had no idea what was happening on the ground. She only remembered the final words her father had spoken. Stay where you are. Near the window, sunlight reflected across the wing. The aircraft had begun its gradual descent toward Seattle. Passengers adjusted seats and gathered personal belongings. But the tension remained. Nobody had forgotten what happened. Nobody had stopped watching. Back in Seattle, Rachel's phone rang. She answered immediately. Her expression changed. Then she looked at Marcus. The airport operations director is on the line. Marcus held out his hand. Rachel passed him the phone. This is Marcus Brooks, he said. The response on the other end was immediate. Respectful. Urgent. Several executives exchanged confused glances. Most of them had worked with Marcus for years. They knew his influence reached far beyond the conference room. What they did not know was how far. Marcus listened for several seconds before speaking again. I will be at gate 14 when that aircraft arrives. He ended the call and picked up his coat. No dramatic speech. No raised voice. Just movement. Deliberate and unstoppable. And somewhere above the clouds, A crew that still believed they controlled the story had no idea the final chapter was already waiting at the gate. The wheels touched the runway with a soft jolt that rippled through the cabin. Normally, passengers would have reached for phones, stretched tired shoulders, and prepared to leave. This time, nobody seemed eager to move. The aircraft rolled toward the terminal while an unusual silence settled over first class. Nicole Hart checked her tablet again. Brian Keller stared toward the front galley. Neither of them looked as confident as they had an hour earlier. Ava Brooks remained seated beside the window. Calm, patient, waiting. Emily Foster watched everything. She had the feeling that the story was approaching a moment nobody aboard fully understood yet. When the aircraft finally reached Gate 14, the seatbelt sign switched off. A familiar chime echoed overhead. Passengers stood. Bags were removed from overhead compartments. Yet the crew near the front door remained strangely tense. Then the aircraft door opened. The first person visible beyond the jet bridge was not a gate agent. It was a tall man in a charcoal overcoat, standing perfectly still. His posture carried the kind of confidence that did not need introductions. Behind him stood several airport executives, 2 operations managers, a legal representative, and a woman carrying a tablet who appeared to be documenting everything. The energy inside the cabin changed instantly. Nicole froze. Brian stopped speaking mid-sentence. Even the passengers nearest the exit sensed something unusual. The man stepped onto the aircraft. Slow, deliberate, unhurried. His eyes moved through the cabin until they found Ava. The tension disappeared from her face immediately. "Dad," she whispered. Marcus Brooks walked forward. Several airline employees standing near the aircraft entrance straightened the moment they saw him. One airport manager lowered his head respectfully. Another stepped aside without being asked. Nicole watched the reactions and felt uncertainty spread across her face. She looked toward Brian. Brian looked toward the airport executives. Nobody seemed comfortable anymore. Marcus stopped beside seat 2A. "Are you okay?" he asked softly. Ava nodded. "I am now." He placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder before turning toward the crew. The cabin became completely silent. Every passenger seemed to stop breathing at once. Marcus looked directly at Nicole, then Brian, then the woman in the cream blazer who suddenly found the window very interesting. "I have spent the last 45 minutes reviewing records associated with this flight," Marcus said calmly. Nobody interrupted. Nobody moved. "My daughter boarded legally. Her identification was valid. Her ticket was valid. Her seat assignment was valid." Each sentence landed like a weight. Heavy, precise, impossible to ignore. Nicole opened her mouth. Nothing came out. Marcus continued. "You questioned her presence before you questioned your assumptions." A long silence followed. Then one of the airport executives stepped forward. His voice sounded careful, respectful. "Mr. Brooks, everything is ready." Several passengers exchanged confused looks. Emily's eyes widened. "Mr. Brooks." Suddenly pieces began connecting. Marcus nodded once before speaking again. "Good." Then he looked around the cabin and delivered the sentence that changed everything. "My name is Marcus Brooks. I serve as Chief Executive Officer of Brooks Global Holdings, one of this airline's largest ownership partners." The reaction was immediate. Faces drained of color. Eyes widened. Conversations died. Nicole looked as though the floor had disappeared beneath her feet. Brian stared in disbelief. Across the cabin, passengers exchanged stunned glances. And for the first time since takeoff, the people who had controlled the narrative realized they no longer controlled anything at all. For several seconds, nobody spoke. The silence inside the aircraft felt almost physical. Marcus Brooks stood calmly in the aisle while the weight of his words settled over every passenger, every crew member, and every airport official gathered near the entrance. Nicole Hart looked down at the tablet, still in her hands, as though it might suddenly offer an explanation. It did not. Facts rarely arrived in time to rescue assumptions. One of the airport operations managers stepped forward carrying a folder. "We completed a preliminary review before landing," he said carefully. "The records are very clear." His voice echoed through the unusually quiet cabin. Miss Brooks was properly ticketed. Her seat assignment was never in question. Her boarding process was completed without incident. Each statement chipped away at the story that had dominated the flight. Brian Keller shifted uncomfortably. The confidence that had carried him through most of the trip had disappeared. In its place stood uncertainty. Emily Foster watched from row 3, her phone resting quietly in her lap. She no longer needed notes. The truth was speaking for itself. The operations manager opened the folder. We also reviewed gate records, passenger manifests, and internal communication logs. Nicole swallowed hard. Several airport officials exchanged serious glances. There is no documentation supporting the concerns raised against Miss Brooks. The words landed with finality. No documentation. No evidence. No issue. Just suspicion. Marcus remained composed. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. That is exactly what concerns me, he said. My daughter spent an entire flight being treated as a problem that records prove never existed. No one challenged him. No one could. Near the front of the cabin, the woman in the cream blazer lowered her eyes. The certainty she carried earlier had vanished completely. Passengers who had quietly agreed with her now avoided eye contact. They had watched a narrative form in real time. They had watched assumptions become accusations. And now they were watching facts dismantle, every one of them. Another airport executive stepped forward with a tablet. We have already initiated a formal review of the incident. The statement caused visible tension among the crew. Nicole's shoulders stiffened. Brian stared at the floor. The executive continued. All relevant communications, reports, and passenger statements have been preserved. Emily raised her hand. Slightly. Including mine? The executive nodded. Including yours. Marcus looked toward Emily. Thank you for speaking up when it would have been easier to stay quiet. Emily offered a small smile. Someone had to. Ava watched the exchange from her seat. For the first time since boarding, the pressure in her chest began to ease. Not because her father was powerful. Not because executives had arrived. Because the truth had finally entered the room. And unlike assumptions, the truth did not need help standing on its own. Around the cabin, passengers slowly began collecting their bags again. But nobody seemed eager to leave. They understood they were witnessing more than an airline investigation. They were watching accountability arrive in real time. And as the airport officials continued reviewing reports and records, one reality became impossible to ignore. The problem had never been Ava Brooks. The problem was what people believed when they looked at her before they knew her story. The cabin slowly emptied, but the impact of what had happened remained. Passengers who had spent the flight watching from a distance now walked past Ava Brooks with entirely different expressions. Some offered quiet smiles. Others nodded respectfully. A few stopped long enough to apologize for staying silent. Ava thanked them politely, but her attention remained on her father. Marcus Brooks stood beside her seat, calm as ever, while airport officials continued their review near the aircraft entrance. Nothing about his posture suggested victory. He was not interested in winning. He was interested in understanding how something so simple had become so complicated. Nicole Hart and Brian Keller remained near the front of the cabin. Neither seemed eager to speak. The certainty that had guided them throughout the flight was gone. In its place stood the uncomfortable reality of reflection. One of the airport executives approached Marcus. The formal review process has already begun, he said. Additional training, policy evaluations, and accountability measures are being discussed. Marcus nodded. Good. The executive hesitated. We are sorry this happened. Marcus looked toward Ava. Before answering, do not be sorry because of who her father is. Be sorry because it happened at all. The statement settled over the remaining passengers like a final lesson. Emily Foster stood nearby with her carry-on bag resting at her side. She smiled at Ava. You handled all of this better than most adults would. Ava laughed softly for the first time all day. I was not sure I was handling it well at all. You were, Emily replied. Trust me. They exchanged a brief hug before parting ways. Then the cabin grew quiet again. Outside the windows, the Seattle sky had turned silver with late afternoon clouds. Ground crews moved across the tarmac. Aircraft arrived and departed. The world continued forward. Marcus picked up Ava's backpack and handed it to her. Ready to go? Ava nodded. Together, they began walking toward the aircraft door. Halfway there, Marcus stopped. Several airport officials turned toward him. So did a handful of remaining passengers. Even Nicole and Brian looked up. Marcus took a slow breath. The worst mistake made today was not questioning a ticket, he said. The worst mistake was deciding who belonged before learning the truth. Nobody interrupted. My daughter should not have needed a powerful father, a witness, or an investigation to be treated fairly. Respect is not something people earn after proving their value. Respect is where you start. The words hung in the air long after he finished speaking. Ava looked at her father and smiled. Not because he was a chief executive officer, not because he had influence, but because he understood something many people never did. Real power was not making people feel small. Real power was making sure they never had to. Together, they stepped off the aircraft and into the jet bridge. Behind them, the cabin remained silent. Ahead of them, the future waited. And somewhere in the minds of everyone who witnessed that flight, one truth would remain impossible to forget. The moment people stop judging appearances and start seeing human beings, everything changes.